Gavel's sharp echo rang through the courtroom, resonating with finality. The judge, a towering figure behind the bench, remained unmoved as he pronounced the verdict. "Guilty," he declared, his voice unwavering, sealing Michael's fate. The words hit like a thunderclap, sending a ripple of shock through the room. Michael, his face pale and eyes wide with disbelief, stood frozen in place. The weight of the accusation crushed him, as the silence stretched, broken only by the stifled sobs of his mother, sitting in the front row. His lawyer, Carol, clenched her jaw, hands balled into fists. She had fought so hard to keep him from this moment. The gavel came down with another echo, sealing his doom. But something was wrong. The case hadn't been straightforward. Too many questions lingered, unanswered. As the courtroom began to empty, Carol's resolve hardened. She would not let this injustice stand. Not for Michael. Not for anyone. Carol sat in her small, dimly lit office, the case files scattered in front of her. She couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. The trial had been too quick, the evidence too neatly packaged. She'd seen enough trials to know when a case didn't add up, but this one felt like it was being pushed into the ground before it had even started. She closed her eyes for a moment, the weight of the situation pressing on her chest. Michael's voice echoed in her head, the desperation in his eyes when he claimed his innocence. Her gut told her he wasn't lying. There was a thread she had to pull. The more she thought about it, the more she realized the trial had been manipulated from the very beginning. There was a hidden hand at play, and it wasn't just the evidence that had been tampered with. It was the system itself, compromised and broken. Carol took a deep breath. She wasn't going to let this go. Carol stood outside Michael's mother's house, the cool night air biting at her skin. She had agreed to meet her again, despite the emotional toll. Inside she knew the truth was waiting, hidden behind layers of pain and fear. When the door opened, Michael's mother, exhausted and fragile, greeted her with a forced smile. The woman was holding on by a thread, yet there was a strength buried deep within her. "Have you found anything?" she asked, her voice cracked. Carol nodded, though she hadn't yet pieced it all together. The investigation was still in its early stages, but she was starting to see the bigger picture. "I believe Michael is innocent," Carol said quietly, looking into the woman's eyes. "But we need to know more about Judge Hawkins. There's something wrong about this whole case, and I intend to find out what it is." Michael's mother nodded slowly, her hope ignited once again. Carol knew it would be a long road, but this was the first step. Carol sat at her desk, the documents spread out before her. The more she dug, the more the corruption unraveled. A name kept cropping up, Judge Hawkins. She couldn't shake the feeling that he was at the center of it all. The financial records, the strange connections, everything led back to him. But there was something else too, something more personal. Carol found a photograph of Michael from years ago, one she hadn't seen before. In the background, a familiar face stood with him, Judge Hawkins. Her heart skipped a beat. Could there be a deeper connection between the judge and Michael? Carol leaned back in her chair, her mind racing. There was so much more to this case than she had initially thought. The answers were within reach, but they were tangled in a web of lies and deceit. The stakes were higher than ever. As Carol continued her investigation, it became clear that someone didn't want the truth to come out. Anonymous threats started arriving at her office, vague warnings and cryptic messages. The more she uncovered, the more dangerous the situation became. Late one evening, after a long day of research, Carol received another envelope. This one was different. No message, just a small, intricately folded piece of paper. It was a picture of Michael's trial, the judge in full view, his face set in stone. Carol's fingers tightened around the photo as her heart skipped a beat. She had always suspected there was more to the judge than met the eye, but this photograph confirmed it. Someone was watching her, waiting for her to make a mistake. Carol exhaled slowly, her determination hardening. There was no going back now. The truth would be uncovered, no matter the cost. Carol walked into the quiet, dimly lit home of Michael's mother, a heavy weight on her chest. The grief in the air was palpable, but there was also something else, a lingering hope that refused to die. Michael's mother, her face worn with the scars of many sleepless nights, was standing at the window, looking out at the empty street. Carol stood in the doorway, hesitant, as if unsure whether she was intruding. But then the older woman turned, her eyes lighting up for a brief moment as she saw Carol. "Did you find something?" she asked, her voice cracking with exhaustion and hope. Carol stepped forward, placing a hand gently on the older woman's shoulder. "I believe we're just beginning to uncover the truth," Carol replied, her voice steady, though she could feel the weight of the responsibility pressing on her. "There are things about this case, things about Judge Hawkins, that don't add up." The words hung in the air between them, as thick and heavy as the silence that followed. Michael's mother's eyes widened, hope flickering anew. "You think he's involved?" she whispered. Carol met her gaze with a resolute nod. "Yes, and I'll prove it." As Carol left Michael's mother's house, the weight of her words settled heavily on her. The truth felt so close, yet there was still so much to untangle. She needed to find more evidence, something concrete, to link Hawkins to the web of lies and corruption that had been meticulously woven. Carol was certain now that Hawkins wasn't just a figurehead. He was orchestrating something far darker, and Michael was only a pawn in the game. The problem was, she didn't know who else was involved, or how deep the corruption went. The more she thought about it, the more unsettling the picture became. Carol paused outside the courthouse, staring at the imposing building. Every day, people walked through those doors, trusting that they would find justice inside. But what if the people they were trusting were the ones manipulating the system? What if Hawkins had turned the very foundation of justice into a weapon? Carol's mind raced with possibilities as she walked towards her car, determined to find the answers, no matter the cost. Carol's investigation led her to a small rundown diner on the outskirts of town. Jake, the detective who had been helping her, was waiting for her at a booth in the back. As Carol slid into the seat across from him, she noticed the look on his face, grim, as though he carried a heavy burden. "What's going on, Jake?" she asked, her voice low. He slid a file across the table, his fingers brushing hers as she took it. "This came from someone inside the courthouse," he said, glancing around to ensure they weren't being watched. The file contained surveillance footage, blurred but clear enough to make out a familiar figure, Judge Hawkins. In the video, Hawkins was meeting with someone in a dark alley, exchanging a briefcase. Carol's stomach twisted. It was the confirmation she needed. "I knew it," she muttered. "He's involved in something far worse than we thought." Jake nodded, his face tight with frustration. "We're not the only ones looking into him. Someone is trying to cover their tracks." The next day, Carol returned to her office, the weight of the footage still fresh in her mind. The video of Judge Hawkins had confirmed her worst suspicions, but it was only a piece of the puzzle. As she sat at her desk, the case file spread out before her, a thought occurred to her. What if the footage was just the beginning? There had to be a paper trail, something tangible that would lead back to Hawkins and his associates. Carol's eyes narrowed as she turned through the pages, looking for any small clue that might connect Hawkins to something larger. Then, as if by fate, she found it. A receipt for a large sum of money paid from an anonymous account, linked directly to the judge. Carol's pulse quickened as she traced the details, realizing the magnitude of what she had just uncovered. She wasn't just investigating a corrupt judge anymore. She was uncovering an underground network of corruption that had seeped into every level of the justice system. She knew she couldn't turn back now. Later that evening, Carol stood in front of the courthouse, the last remnants of daylight fading into the night. She knew what she had to do next. The evidence was piling up, and every lead pointed to Judge Hawkins, but she needed more than just paperwork and surveillance footage. She needed a confession. Carol knew the risks confronting Hawkins directly could expose her to danger, but she couldn't afford to wait any longer. As she walked toward the entrance, the doors swung open, and she stepped into the cold, imposing lobby of the courthouse. The walls seemed to close in around her as she approached the elevators. Carol's thoughts were a whirlwind. She had come too far to back out now. Whatever happened, she would bring Hawkins down, and she would clear Michael's name. She was ready for the confrontation that would change everything. Carol stared at the file in front of her, each page revealing more than she had expected. The evidence was mounting, but so was the danger. She had just spoken to a whistleblower inside the courthouse, someone who was terrified but desperate to help. "They're all in on it," the source had whispered, barely audible over the phone. "Hawkins isn't just a judge, he's running an underground network, and everyone is involved." Carol's heart raced as the implications settled in. Every person she trusted, every ally she thought she had, could be compromised. The walls were closing in. She couldn't trust anyone, but she had no choice but to push forward. The whistleblower had sent her a folder filled with evidence that could expose the judge and the syndicate. But there was one problem. The folder had been intercepted. It was clear someone was watching her every move, but she couldn't stop now. She would find a way to get the information back, no matter the cost. The next morning, Carol met with Jake in a secluded park, away from prying eyes. He was visibly shaken, his usual composure replaced by a nervous energy. "They're on to us, Carol," Jake said, running a hand through his short black hair. "I don't know how much longer I can keep helping you." Carol watched him closely, noticing the fear in his eyes. This was more than just a case to him now. This was a matter of survival. "You've already done more than enough," Carol replied, her voice calm but firm. "But we're not stopping. We're close, Jake, I know it." She handed him a USB drive containing the last bit of evidence she had recovered. "Take this to a secure location. It's our insurance, just in case." Jake nodded reluctantly, but Carol could see the unease written all over his face. The game had changed. They weren't just hunting down corruption anymore, they were being hunted too. Later that day, Carol returned to her office, only to find a chilling message waiting for her. It was an anonymous letter, slipped under her door. "Stop digging or you'll be the next to disappear." The handwriting was spidery, as if written in haste, and the words were scrawled in red ink, making them all the more menacing. Carol's blood ran cold, but her resolve only hardened. She had no choice now but to push forward. The threats were only making her more determined to bring Hawkins down. As she sat down at her desk, the weight of the situation began to sink in. She was no longer just fighting for Michael's freedom, she was fighting for her own life. The walls around her were closing in, and she could feel the danger growing with every step she took. But Carol refused to back down. "I'm not afraid," she muttered to herself, her fingers gripping the letter. The game was on. Carol spent the following hours reviewing every piece of evidence she had gathered. The letter, the surveillance footage, the bank statements, all pointed to one thing. The truth was slipping further and further out of her reach. Just as she was about to give in to the overwhelming pressure, her phone rang. It was Jake. His voice was shaky, urgent. "Carol, they know. I've been followed and someone's inside my apartment. I don't know how much longer I can stay safe." Carol's heart skipped a beat. She had known this day might come, but the reality of it hit her like a wave. "Get out of there now," she said, her voice sharp with panic. "Head to the safe house. I'll meet you there." As she hung up the phone, Carol's mind raced. If Jake was compromised, then the evidence was in danger. The game was escalating, and she couldn't let it get to him. She had to move fast, or everything they had worked for would be lost. Carol arrived at the safe house just as the sun began to set, casting an orange hue over the streets. She found Jake in the small bare room, his face pale and eyes wide with fear. He was pacing, his hand constantly running through his hair, unable to sit still. "I don't know how they found me," he muttered. "I thought I was being careful." Carol stepped into the room, closing the door behind her with a soft click. "It doesn't matter," she said, her voice steady despite the situation. "What matters now is that we stick together. We'll get out of here, but we need to be smart." Jake looked up, meeting her gaze. "How? They're everywhere." Carol didn't answer immediately. Instead, she walked to the small window, peering out at the street below. "I have a plan," she said finally, her voice cold with resolve. "But we need to move fast. Hawkins doesn't know it yet, but his time is running out." Carol arrived at the courthouse in the dead of night, determined to confront Judge Hawkins. She knew this was the moment that could change everything. She had gathered the evidence, pieced together the puzzle, but now she needed the final piece, a confession. She waited outside the judge's office, the cold wind biting at her skin as she tried to calm her nerves. The door creaked open, and there stood Hawkins, a man in his late 50s, with an air of authority that demanded respect. His sharp eyes met hers, and for a moment, they stood in silence. "I thought you would come sooner," Hawkins said, his voice low, almost amused. Carol stepped forward, her eyes fixed on him, the weight of the years of corruption pressing down on her. "It ends tonight," she said firmly. Hawkins' smile faltered for a split second, and Carol saw the flicker of something deeper, fear. "You don't know what you're up against," he warned, his voice now sharp with an edge of menace. "I've already won." But Carol wasn't backing down. "We'll see about that," she replied, her voice unwavering. This was her moment. There was no turning back now. As Carol and Hawkins stood facing each other, the tension thick in the air, Carol felt the truth teetering on the edge of exposure. Hawkins' confidence seemed to waver as he realized Carol wasn't backing down. "You have no idea what you've gotten yourself into," Hawkins said, his voice colder now. Carol could see the cracks in his facade. The power he once wielded was slipping away. She took a step closer, her voice low but forceful. "I have the evidence, Judge. I know about your deals, your corruption, and I'm going to make sure everyone knows the truth." Hawkins' eyes narrowed, his hands instinctively clenching at his sides. "Do you really think they'll believe you?" he sneered. Carol met his gaze without hesitation. "They will. And you'll pay for everything you've done." There was a moment of silence before Hawkins spoke again, his voice a whisper of desperation. "You don't understand. This goes much deeper than you think." But Carol was already shaking her head. "I'm not afraid of you anymore." Suddenly, the door behind them creaked open, and a figure stepped into the room. It was Jake. His face was pale, and his eyes darted nervously between Carol and Hawkins. "Carol, you need to get out of here," Jake said, his voice strained with urgency. Carol turned to him, confusion and concern crossing her face. "What's going on?" she asked. But before Jake could respond, Hawkins let out a dark laugh. "You're too late," he said, his voice filled with satisfaction. "You think you can stop me? You're already too deep in this game to escape now." Carol's heart raced as she turned to Jake. "What do you mean, too deep?" she demanded. Jake's eyes were filled with fear as he took a step back. I've been working for him," Jake admitted, his voice barely above a whisper. "I never wanted it to go this far, but he had something on me. I couldn't escape." The words hit Carol like a punch to the stomach. She had trusted Jake, believed in him. But now, he was part of the conspiracy. She took a step back, shock and betrayal written all over her face. Carol stepped back, trying to process the weight of Jake's confession. "You've been working for him this whole time?" she asked, her voice shaky but resolute. Jake lowered his head, his shoulders slumped in defeat. "I never wanted it to go this far," he said, his voice filled with regret. "I was just trying to survive. But now I see what it's become." Carol felt her world shatter. Jake had been her ally, the one person she thought she could trust. But now, everything was in question. Hawkins stepped forward, his smile widening. "It's too late for you, Carol. Your investigation ends here." But Carol was not ready to give up. "You won't get away with this," she said, her voice stronger than she felt. Hawkins chuckled darkly. "I already have." Just as he stepped closer, a loud noise rang out from the hallway, footsteps approaching fast. "They're coming," Jake whispered urgently. "We have to go now." Carol didn't hesitate. She grabbed the USB drive from her bag and slipped it into her pocket. "We're not done yet," she said, her voice filled with renewed determination. Carol and Jake hurried down the hallway, the sound of approaching footsteps growing louder with every passing second. "We don't have much time," Jake said, glancing nervously over his shoulder. Carol was determined, her mind racing with thoughts of how to turn the tide. "I've got the evidence," she said. "Now we just need to get it to the right people." The sounds of footsteps grew louder, and Carol's heart pounded in her chest. They reached a dead-end corridor, and for a moment Carol felt trapped. She turned to Jake, her eyes narrowing. "We can't let Hawkins win. We have to expose him, no matter what." Jake nodded, his face grim. "I'll do whatever it takes," he said, though his voice was filled with doubt. Just as they turned to escape, a door at the end of the hall swung open, and armed guards stepped into view. This is it, Carol thought, her mind racing for a way out. She had come too far to back down now. The silence in the hallway was deafening as Carol and Jake stood facing the armed guards. They had nowhere to run, and the walls seemed to close in around them. Carol's pulse raced, but she knew there was no turning back. "Jake, we have to move now," Carol whispered, her voice steady despite the rising panic. She could feel the weight of everything that had happened so far. Hawkins' corruption, the lives ruined, and the fact that they had come so close to exposing it all rested on this moment. Jake's eyes darted around the hallway, and Carol could see his fear. "I'm not leaving you," he said. "Not now." Just as the guards advanced, a distant sound, a car screeching to a halt, echoed down the corridor. "It's our only chance," Carol said urgently. Without waiting for Jake's response, she grabbed his hand and pulled him toward a side exit. The guards were too focused on their approach to notice them slip away. The tension in Carol's body didn't relax until they were safely outside, the cold night air hitting her face. But they weren't safe yet. Not by a long shot. The game was still on. Once they reached the outside, the cool night air felt like a breath of relief. But Carol knew this was far from over. "Where do we go now?" Jake asked, his voice low, glancing around nervously. Carol took a deep breath, her mind racing. "We head to the safe house. We have to get this evidence to the right people before they catch up with us." As they moved quickly through the streets, Carol couldn't shake the feeling of being followed. Every car that passed seemed like a threat. Every shadow felt too dark. "I never thought it would come to this," Jake muttered, his eyes scanning the street. Carol remained silent. She had known the risks from the beginning. But she also knew that exposing Hawkins was the only way to stop the corruption. "We've made it this far," Carol said, her voice steady. "We can't stop now." Jake nodded, though his face was lined with exhaustion and doubt. "I just hope it's worth it," he said softly. But Carol didn't answer. She was too focused on the task ahead. The closer they got to the safe house, the more she realized that their fight was far from over, but it was their only chance. As they approached the safe house, Carol's phone buzzed with a message. She pulled it from her pocket, her eyes scanning the screen. It was from the whistleblower. "They know where you are. Get out now." Carol's stomach dropped. They had been followed, and their time was running out. She turned to Jake, her heart racing. "We need to move. Now." Without hesitation, she led the way toward the back entrance of the safe house, her thoughts a whirlwind of strategies and contingencies. They reached the door, but before they could get inside, the sound of approaching footsteps echoed in the alley. Carol's mind raced as she slammed her hand against the door, trying to get it open. "It's locked," Jake shouted, panic creeping into his voice. Carol glanced over her shoulder, the footsteps growing closer. She didn't have time to think. With one swift motion, she kicked the door open, the splintering wood adding to the chaos. They rushed inside, the heavy door slamming behind them, just as they heard voices shouting from the alley. They were safe. For now. Inside the safe house, Carol and Jake stood panting, their hearts racing. The adrenaline had them both on edge. Carol quickly checked the room, making sure no one had followed them. "We don't have much time," Carol said, her voice urgent. "I'll upload the files to the secure server, and you need to contact the press." Jake nodded but didn't move. His eyes were distant, clouded with doubt. "Is it really going to work?" he asked quietly. Carol met his gaze. "We're exposing Hawkins. No matter what, this has to end now." Jake swallowed hard, then nodded. He stepped toward the computer, but Carol stopped him. "You're sure you're ready for this?" she asked, her tone soft. Jake looked at her, the weight of the situation clear in his eyes. "I'm in. Let's finish this," he said, his voice stronger now. As they worked together, Carol's mind raced. She could feel the walls closing in. They had done everything they could to cover their tracks, but they had no idea how much time they had left. As Carol and Jake finalized their plan, the safe house phone rang, sending a jolt of panic through Carol. She grabbed the receiver, her heart pounding. This is it, she thought. They've found us. But when she answered, the voice on the other end was familiar. It was the whistleblower, now identified. It's done, the voice said. The evidence is in the hands of the press. You've done it. Carol's mind raced. It's over? She asked, her voice tight. The whistleblower paused before replying. It's just beginning. They'll try to cover it up, but this time it won't work. Carol slowly exhaled, feeling the weight of everything they'd been through lift ever so slightly. Thank you, she said, her voice sincere. As she hung up the phone, she looked at Jake, who had been silently watching. We did it, Carol said, her voice filled with exhaustion but also triumph. Jake gave a tired smile, but there was still a long road ahead. Yeah, he said quietly. But it's not over yet. Carol nodded, knowing that their fight had only just begun. The morning after the press release, Carol sat in her dimly lit office, staring at the headlines on her computer screen. The media had finally picked up the story, and it was everywhere. Hawkins, the judge she'd been chasing for so long, was now in the public eye, exposed for his deep involvement in corruption. The city was buzzing with anger and disbelief, but there was a sense of bittersweet triumph for Carol. She had done it. The truth was finally out. Yet, as she read through the articles, she couldn't shake the unease that lingered in her gut. What would happen next? Hawkins had powerful connections, and Carol knew the fight was far from over. As she closed the laptop and leaned back in her chair, she caught sight of the small framed photo on her desk. A picture of Michael, smiling, a reminder of why she had taken this journey. This isn't over, but we've made it through the first battle, she whispered to herself, her fingers lightly tracing the edge of the frame. Later that day, Carol met with Michael and his mother. They sat together in a small cafe, the quiet hum of conversation in the background. Michael's face was a mixture of relief and disbelief, his eyes still wide from the events of the past few days. I never thought this day would come, he said quietly, his voice heavy with emotion. His mother, sitting beside him, squeezed his hand. You've been through so much, Michael, she said, her voice soft but filled with love. Carol smiled, her heart warmed by the sight. You deserve this, both of you, she replied. The road ahead might be tough, but we've made sure the truth is out there, and that's what matters. Michael looked at her, his eyes filled with gratitude. I don't know how to thank you, he said. Carol shook her head. You don't have to, she said gently. Just live your life, Michael. That's all I want for you. The moment was brief but poignant, a moment of peace amidst the chaos they had endured. That evening, Carol stood at the edge of the city, gazing out over the skyline. The weight of everything she had been through seemed to lift with the setting sun. She had faced countless obstacles, but now the air felt different, lighter somehow. She thought back to the countless nights spent in her office, piecing together the truth and the toll it had taken on her. But as the city lights flickered to life in the distance, Carol realized that she had fought for something bigger than herself. She had fought for justice, for Michael, for everyone who had been silenced. A breeze blew through her hair, and Carol closed her eyes for a moment, savoring the peace she had fought so hard to achieve. But in the back of her mind, she knew this wasn't the end. The system was still broken, and it would take more than one victory to fix it. But for tonight, she allowed herself a moment of quiet satisfaction. Justice had been served. As the days passed, Carol continued to monitor the fallout from the scandal. The media coverage was relentless, and Hawkins' name was being dragged through the mud. But it wasn't just him. The whole system was being questioned. The corruption that had festered in the courthouse for years was finally under scrutiny. Carol knew the fight wasn't over, but this was a significant victory. She had expected backlash, expected resistance, but what she didn't expect was the support. People were speaking out, demanding accountability, and the tide was beginning to turn. For the first time in a long while, Carol felt a sense of hope. She stood at her office window, looking out at the city once again. "This isn't over," she said to herself quietly. "But it's a start." And for the first time in what felt like forever, she believed it. A few weeks later, Carol stood in front of a crowd at a community meeting. The room was filled with people who had been affected by the same corrupt system she had exposed. She was there to speak about the importance of transparency, accountability, and the need for continued reform. As she looked around the room, Carol realized how far she had come. She had started this journey alone, driven by the desire for justice, but now she stood with an entire community behind her, fighting for the same cause. "This is just the beginning," she said, her voice strong and steady. "We've made a difference, but we cannot stop now. There's still work to be done." The room erupted in applause, and for the first time in a long time, Carol felt the weight of the journey lighten. There was still much to fight for, but now, she wasn't fighting alone. The courtroom was packed with reporters, law enforcement, and a sea of onlookers. Carol stood in the back, her eyes fixed on the judge's bench as the proceedings began. The judge, a new face since Hawkins' downfall, called the court to order. Carol's heart was heavy with a mix of relief and apprehension. The trial of those responsible for Hawkins' network of corruption was now in full swing, but Carol knew this wouldn't be a quick resolution. Justice was a long road, and though this was a major step forward, there was still much work to do. She glanced at Michael, sitting with his mother in the front row. His eyes met hers briefly, and a slight knowing nod passed between them. For the first time in years, Michael seemed at peace. The weight of his wrongful conviction finally lifted. "It's not over," Carol thought as the court proceedings continued. "But it's a beginning." As the trial continued, Carol's mind wandered back to the long journey that had led them here. From the first time Michael had claimed his innocence to the whispers of corruption she had uncovered. It had all felt like a distant dream at times. But now, as she watched the courtroom buzz with tension, Carol felt the weight of their victory settle on her shoulders. She had faced so much resistance, but she had never backed down. And now, justice was on the horizon. The journey wasn't over, but today marked a turning point. The real victory wasn't just in exposing Hawkins' corruption. It was in proving that one person's voice could make a difference. Carol's gaze shifted to Michael again. He was no longer the man accused. He was now a symbol of resilience, of the power to rise above the odds. Later that evening, Carol stood in front of her apartment building, the cool breeze tousling her hair. The streets were quieter now, the sounds of the city fading into the background. She felt a strange sense of calm, a peace she hadn't known in months. It was over. The fight had been hard, and there had been times when she wondered if it was worth it. But now, standing in the quiet, she knew it had been. As Carol looked up at the stars, she felt a sense of closure wash over her. But she also knew that this was just the beginning of a new chapter. The world had changed because of what they'd done, and though there was still much work to be done, Carol felt ready for whatever came next. For the first time she allowed herself to smile, a smile of quiet satisfaction and hope. The next few weeks were a blur of media coverage, interviews, and public outcry. The world had taken notice of the corruption that had festered in the justice system. Carol had become a symbol of hope for those who had lost faith in the system. But as she sat in her office, the weight of responsibility began to settle back onto her shoulders. There was still much to be done. The corruption had not ended with Hawkins. There were still those in power who sought to protect their own interests at all costs. As she looked at the papers on her desk, Carol knew she could not rest. The fight for justice would be a lifelong endeavor, but she was no longer afraid of it. The more she learned, the stronger she became. She was ready for whatever came next. Carol stood on the courthouse steps, eyes scanning the crowd. The setting sun cast a golden light over the gathering. The community, united by the truth, stood together. "This is just the beginning," Carol said, her voice filled with hope. "We've taken the first step toward change, but we must keep going." The crowd erupted in applause, their support ringing out. Carol smiled, pride swelling in her chest. The journey had been long, but for now, justice had been served, and the world was watching.